The saloon's batwing doors creaked in the hot afternoon wind as 5 outlaws swaggered down Redemption Springs' main street, their boots kicking up dust with each purposeful step. Their target sat alone on the saloon's porch, just some quiet. Rancher nursing a cup of coffee, seemingly lost in thought. They saw the simple clothes, the unassuming posture, the way he kept to himself. Easy prey. "Well, boys," their leader drawled, fingers dancing over his holster, "looks like we found ourselves some entertainment." The gang's laughter echoed down the street, but the rancher didn't flinch, didn't even look up. They couldn't know that. His calloused hands had notched more gunfights than their entire gang combined, or that his silence wasn't born of fear, but of a past written in gunsmoke and blood. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn always found Thomas Wade in the same spot, leaning against his front porch railing, watching the sun paint the Wyoming sky in shades of amber and gold. His ranch, modest but meticulously maintained, sprawled across 40 acres of hard-won land that he'd purchased with savings he never spoke about. The local folks knew better than to ask where the money came from, just like they never asked about the way he checked every room before sleeping, or how his eyes always found the exits. First, when he entered the general store. Most days, Wade worked his land with the same careful precision he applied to everything else. His movements, whether mending fences or breaking horses, carried an economy of motion that spoke of years spent making every gesture count. The ranch hands he employed, just 2 young brothers named Carson, had learned early on that their boss could move like a cat when he wanted to. Despite his graying temples and the slight stiffness in his right knee on cold mornings, Sarah Chen, who ran the general store with her father, was one of the few who'd earned something close to friendship with Wade. She noticed things others missed, like how he never sat with his back to a door, or the way his right hand would sometimes drift to his hip where a gun belt might once have hung. Every first Monday of the month, Wade would come in for supplies and Sarah would have his order ready. Coffee, ammunition for his rifle, never pistol ammunition, she noted, and whatever books had arrived on the weekly stage. "You know, Mr. Wade," she'd said once, "most ranchers don't read Shakespeare." His response had been typical Wade. A slight smile, a thoughtful pause, and then, "Most ranchers haven't had as much cause to think about tragedy as I have, Miss Chen." The town of Redemption Springs had accepted Wade's quiet presence over the past 5 years. He paid his taxes on time, helped neighbors when asked, and never caused trouble. Sheriff Matthews even made him a deputy once, during a particularly rowdy cattle season. But Wade had politely declined. "Best I stay just a rancher," he'd said, and something in his tone made Matthews drop the subject. But there were stories, whispered tales that circulated through saloons and around campfires. Some claimed they'd seen him draw and fire his rifle at a rattlesnake faster than any man had right to move. Others swore they recognized him from somewhere, though they could never quite place where. Old Jim Tucker, 3 whiskeys deep at the saloon, once claimed Wade was actually the infamous Ghost of Wyoming, a gunslinger so quick and deadly he was said to kill men before they even cleared leather. Tucker was laughed out of the saloon that night, but the next day folks noticed Wade stayed in his ranch for a week straight. What nobody questioned was the respect Wade had earned. He didn't earn it with boasts or displays of power, but with the steady reliability of a man who knew himself. When young Billy Carson broke his arm falling from a horse, Wade set the bone himself, his hands moving with the sureness of someone who dealt with far worse injuries. When drought threatened the county 2 summers ago, it was Wade who showed the other ranchers how to dig deeper wells and conserve water in ways that spoke of hard-learned desert wisdom. Yet for all his capability, Wade remained a mystery. The rifle above his mantle looked well-maintained, but unused. The locked chest in his bedroom, which Sarah had glimpsed once while delivering medicine during a fever, bore scratches that might have come from gun oil. And sometimes, on quiet, Nights, visitors reported hearing him walking the perimeter of his property, checking fence lines that had been secure for years. Thomas Wade had built himself a life of quiet purpose in Redemption Springs. But as he sat there now, on the saloon's porch, watching 5 troublemakers approach with violence in their eyes, the weight of his past settled around his shoulders like an old, familiar coat. The coffee in his cup had gone cold, but he didn't notice. His mind was already calculating angles, distances, and the odds that he could avoid breaking the promise he'd made to himself 5 years ago, a promise written in blood and sealed with a gunfighter's last breath. The Devil's Hand Gang had carved their reputation across 3 territories with the precision of a surgeon and the mercy of a rattlesnake. Their leader, Marcus Devil Durant, wore his namesake well, a crude devil tattooed on his gun hand, which had sent 17 men to their graves in the past year alone. The ink would be the last thing his victims saw as he drew, a final mockery of their fate. Riding with Durant were 4 men equally versed in cruelty. Jed, the preacher. Wilson carried a Bible in his saddle and quoted scripture while robbing stagecoaches. His white collar, stolen from a minister he'd killed in Kansas, was permanently stained with trail dust and gunpowder. The Kellerman brothers, Tom and Frank, were tracker killers from Texas who'd learned their trade, hunting escaped slaves, and had never lost their taste for the chase. And lastly, there was Mexican Pete, whose real name no one knew, a knife fighter, who could split a playing card at 20 paces and took pleasure in proving it with human targets. Their pattern was always the same. They'd ride into a quiet town like Redemption Springs, size up the local law enforcement, and then begin their game. They'd find someone to make an example of, usually a respected citizen, and break them publicly. It wasn't about the money. For Durant's gang, the robberies that followed were almost an afterthought. What they craved was the terror in people's eyes, the way a confident man's hands would shake when the preacher started reciting last rites, the sound of a proud woman's tears as the Kellermans described what would happen if her husband played. Hero. 3 weeks ago, they'd destroyed the town of Copper Creek. The sheriff there had tried to stand against them. They'd tied him to his own desk and made him watch as they burned the bank's money in front of the townspeople. $20,000 in government notes turned to ash, while Durant explained that some lessons were worth more than gold. Then they'd shot the sheriff's wife in the street, not killing her but making sure she'd never walk again. Their message was clear. Resistance brought worse than death. The gang had been moving north since then, following the stage line through Wyoming territory. Redemption Springs wasn't their largest target, but Durant had chosen it for a reason. Word had reached him about a town that was too peaceful, too untouched by the chaos that plagued the frontier. A place like that, he told his men while they camped under the stars, needs to learn what the world's really like, and we're just the teachers they need. What Durant couldn't know was that fate had played him a cruel hand. Of all the towns, in Wyoming, he'd chosen the one where a legend had buried his guns. Of all the men he could have picked to torment, he'd settled on the one whose body count had once earned him whispered warnings around campfires across the West. The Devil's Hand Gang had built their reputation on breaking good men, but they'd never tried to break a man who'd spent his life breaking better killers than them. The townspeople, watching from behind curtained windows as the gang approached Wade, didn't know whether to pray for peace or prepare for war. Those old enough to remember the stories of the ghost of Wyoming found themselves wondering if the tales were true. Could one man really be as deadly as the legends claimed? And if he was, what would it mean for their quiet town when the violence they'd all fled finally caught up with them? Sarah Chen stood in her store's doorway, her hand clutching the frame until her knuckles went white. She'd seen Wade's eyes that morning when he'd come for his coffee, seen something there she'd never noticed before, a cold calculation that didn't belong on any rancher's face. Now, watching him sit motionless as 5 killers approached, she understood what she'd glimpsed. It was the look of a man who'd seen this moment coming for 5 long years and had hoped against hope that it would pass him by. Sheriff John Matthews stood at his office window, watching the scene unfold outside the saloon. His hand unconsciously traced the edges of a weathered wanted poster hidden in his desk drawer. A poster he'd never turned in. The sketch on it was younger, the face harder, but the eyes were the same ones he'd seen every Monday morning for the past 5 years when Thomas Wade came to town for supplies. The ghost of Wyoming. That's what they'd called him during the Lincoln County War. Matthews had been a deputy then, fresh-faced and eager, when the stories first reached him. Tales of a gunfighter who moved like shadow and struck like lightning. Unlike most legends of the West, the ghost's reputation wasn't built on boasts or barroom tales. His victims simply ceased to exist. Entire gangs found dead in their camps, posses that went after him never returning, corrupt marshals discovered in their offices with their guns still in their holsters. What made Wade different was his code. He never killed innocent people, never robbed, never took advantage of the weak. He was a surgeon with a gun, cutting out the cancer that plagued the territories. The name Ghost came from his victims' last words. They'd swear they never even saw him draw. Matthews remembered the day it all changed. 7 years ago, in a town called Devil's Fork, Wade had faced down the notorious Mackenzie gang. By sunset, 14 men lay dead, including 3 bystanders caught in the crossfire. The violence had finally crossed a line that even the ghost couldn't live with. He'd walked into the sheriff's office, laid down his guns, and vanished. 2 years later, when a quiet rancher bought the old Peterson place outside Redemption Springs, Matthews had recognized him immediately, but Wade had met his eyes with a silent plea that the sheriff understood all too well, the plea of a man seeking redemption. So Matthews had buried the wanted poster in his desk and watched as the legendary gunfighter poured his skill and precision into building a new life. Now, watching Durant's gang approach Wade, Matthews felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He'd kept Wade's secret, believing the man had earned his peace. But he'd also sworn an oath to protect his town. If Wade remained true to his new life and refused to fight, Redemption Springs would fall like Copper Creek. If he returned to his old ways, the violence that followed might tear the town apart. Anyway, the sheriff's fingers brushed the grip of his own revolver. He was good with a gun, better than most lawmen, but against the Devil's Hand gang he knew his limitations. Durant's reputation wasn't built on lies. The man was a killer of exceptional skill, and his gang was just as deadly. In any other situation, Matthews would already be out there, standing between trouble and his town, but something held him back. It wasn't fear that stayed his hand, it was memory. The memory of a dusty afternoon in Lincoln County when he'd witnessed the ghost in action. 3 outlaws had tried to rob the bank, using hostages as shields. Wade had appeared from nowhere, and in the space of 2 heartbeats, all 3 men were dead. Their guns hadn't cleared leather, the hostages were untouched. It wasn't just skill, it was something beyond that, something almost supernatural in its perfection. Looking at Wade now, Matthews could see the same calm precision in his posture. Most men facing 5 killers would show some sign of tension. Wade just sat there still as a mourning pond, waiting. The sheriff knew that stillness. It was the pause before a rattler struck, the moment before lightning split the sky. The wanted poster in his drawer offered a reward of $5,000, dead or alive. Below the sketch was a list of confirmed kills, 37. But Matthews knew the real number was higher, much higher. And as he watched Durant's gang stop in front of the saloon, he wondered if that number was about to grow. Durant planted his boots squarely in front of Wade's table, casting a shadow over the cold coffee. The other 4 spread out in a practice formation, Mexican Pete and the preacher flanking their leader, while the Kellerman brothers drifted to the edges of the porch, cutting off any escape routes. The few townspeople still on the street quickly disappeared into doorways and behind wagons. "You know what I see?" Durant drawled, hooking his thumbs in his gun belt. "I see a man who thinks he's too good to stand when his betters arrive." The devil tattoo on his hand seemed to dance as he flexed his fingers. "Could be we need to teach some manners." Wade's eyes remained fixed on his coffee cup, as if the growing ripples in the dark liquid held more interest than the 5 killers surrounding him. His stillness seemed to draw the air from the scene, creating a vacuum of tension that made the preacher shift uncomfortably. "Maybe he's simple," Frank Kellerman suggested, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto the porch near Wade's boot. "Seen it before. Fellas get kicked by a horse, ain't right after." Mexican Pete's hand drifted to the knife at his belt. "Or perhaps he is deaf. We should check, no?" His blade whispered against leather as he drew it part way. Wade's first movement was so subtle it was almost missed. A slight tilt of his head, just enough to catch the sunlight on his face. The motion revealed eyes that weren't vacant or afraid, but instead held the cold calculation of a man measuring coffin dimensions. "I've killed men for less than ignoring me," Durant said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He leaned forward, placing his hands on Wade's table. "But I'm feeling generous today. Stand up, apologize, and buy us all a drink. Then maybe you're in my light." Wade's voice, when it finally came, was quiet, but carried the weight of mountain stone. Those 3 words, spoken without heat or emphasis, cut through Durant's speech like a knife through silk. The gang leader straightened, his face darkening with rage. "Well, well," the preacher chuckled, though there was an edge of uncertainty in his laugh. "The mute can speak after all." Durant's hand moved to his holster, fingers brushing the worn grip of his Colt. "Last chance, old man. On your feet, or we'll see if you can talk as well laying down." Wade's cup settled onto its saucer with a gentle clink. His weathered hands remained in plain view on the table, relaxed and open. But something in his posture had changed. A subtle shift that made Mexican Pete take half a step backward without knowing why. "5 men, Wade said, his voice still quiet, but reaching every ear on the porch, drawing on one who hasn't moved against them. His eyes finally rose to meet Durant's. "That's not the mark of better men. That's the mark of cowards." The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Durant's face twisted with fury as he drew his pistol in a blur of motion, only to freeze at what he saw in Wade's eyes. There was no fear there, no anger, not even resignation. There was only a cold certainty that made Durant's practiced draw feel suddenly amateur. The devil on his hand seemed to pale as Wade's gaze fell upon it. For the first time in years, Marcus Devil Durant felt the foreign touch of doubt creep into his gut. He'd started this dance expecting to toy with prey, only to find himself staring into the eyes of something far deadlier than himself. The moment shattered when Sarah Chen's scream cut through the tension. Mexican Pete had slipped away during the confrontation, and now he emerged from the general store, holding Sarah with his knife pressed against her throat. Her father lay, unconscious behind the counter, a growing bruise on his temple. Perhaps now the old man will show proper respect, no? Pete's smile revealed gold-capped teeth as he pressed the blade closer to Sarah's skin. A thin red line appeared beneath its edge. Wade's hands remained flat on the table, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle change that made the air feel suddenly colder. When he spoke, his voice carried none of its previous quiet calm. Instead, it resonated with an authority that made even Durant's finger pause on his trigger. "Let her go." Each word fell like a hammer strike. "This is between us." The preacher's laugh held a nervous edge. "Looks to me like it's between you and—" "Her pretty neck. Stand up slow, hands where we can see them." Wade's eyes met Sarah's terrified gaze. 5 years of quiet friendship passed between them in that look. She'd never seen this side of him, this deadly stillness that seemed to drop the temperature around them. But somehow, seeing it now didn't frighten her more. It made her feel safer. 3 seconds, Wade said, his voice carrying across the street like a death knell. After that, what happens can't be undone. You're not in any position, Durant started. 1. Mexican Pete's grin widened. Maybe I give the China doll a little scar to remember. 2. Sarah felt the knife tremble slightly against her throat. Pete's confidence was wavering, though. He couldn't say why. The word never finished. Wade moved. Later, witnesses would argue about what they saw. Some claimed Wade had drawn a hidden gun. Others swore he'd never left his chair. All anyone knew for certain was that Mexican Pete suddenly screamed, his knife hand bending at an impossible angle. Sarah found herself pulled free and pushed toward the store, even as Pete's body hit the porch boards. Wade stood now, and the transformation was complete. Gone was the quiet rancher who read Shakespeare. In his place stood something else, a figure that seemed to draw shadows around him despite the afternoon sun. Durant's gun was still pointed at him, but the gang leader's hand had started to shake. You just signed your death warrant, Durant snarled, but his voice lacked its usual menace. No. Wade's reply was soft, almost sad. You did that when you brought an innocent into this. His right hand hung near his hip, empty, but somehow more threatening than any drawn weapon. I've spent 5 years trying to leave the killing behind. 5 years working the land, building something peaceful. You could have picked any other town, any other man, but you chose here, and you chose me, and now there's no walking back from what comes next. The preacher had started reciting last rites, but the words stumbled in his throat as Wade's gaze fell upon him. The Kellerman brothers found themselves backing away, their usual swagger replaced by something primal, the instinct of prey recognizing a predator. I know you, Durant whispered suddenly, his face draining of color. Those eyes, they said. The ghost of Wyoming died years ago. He did. Wade's voice carried the finality of a coffin lid closing. You just dug him up. Sheriff Matthews emerged from his office, rifle in hand, but Wade's slight headshake stopped him in his tracks. The lawman understood. This was beyond the law now. This was legend coming back to life. The devil tattoo on Durant's hand seemed to writhe as he pointed his gun. He'd started this day thinking he was the deadliest thing for 100 miles. Now, staring into the eyes of a myth made real, he realized just how wrong he'd been. Wade's boots left no sound on the wooden stairs of his ranch house as he climbed to the attic. The confrontation at the saloon had ended in a temporary stalemate. Durant's gang retreating to plan, leaving threats hanging in the air like storm clouds. But Wade knew better than most. Sometimes the promise of violence cut deeper than violence itself. They'd be back, and innocents like Sarah would be their leverage. The attic air hung thick with dust and memory as Wade knelt before an old trunk pushed against the far wall. His fingers traced the familiar patterns in the wood, not decorations, but a map of notches. Each mark represented a life taken, a death that had helped build the legend of the ghost. He'd stopped counting after 50. Inside the trunk, wrapped in oiled canvas, lay the tools of his former trade. 2 Colt peacemakers, their blued steel still perfect after 5 years of rest, custom grips of aged mesquite wood, worn to fit his hands like they were part of him. Gun belt of hand-tooled leather, the holsters positioned just so, the result of countless hours perfecting the draw that had made him famous. Thought we were finished, he whispered to the weapons, his voice carrying the weight of broken promises. The guns offered no reply, but their presence filled the room with unspoken possibilities. Each piece had been modified to his exact specifications, triggers smoothed to break like icicles, cylinders honed to turn like silk. They weren't just weapons, they were extensions of his will. As he lifted the gun belt, memories flooded back. The weight of it around his hips had once been as natural as breathing. Now it felt like shackles, the heavy burden of returning to a life he'd fought so hard to leave behind. But the alternative was worse. He'd seen what Durant's gang had done to Copper Creek. The thought of Sarah, of the town he'd grown to care for, suffering that fate. Wade began his preparations with the same methodical precision that had once made him legend. Each bullet was checked and loaded with care. The leather was cleaned and softened. Mechanisms were oiled with practiced hands that remembered every motion, every detail that could mean the difference between life and death. Standing before the mirror in his bedroom, Wade watched himself strap on the guns. The transformation was subtle but profound. His posture shifted, weight balanced differently, hands hanging with calculated readiness. The quiet rancher seemed to fade like morning mist, revealing the steel beneath. The ghost had always been there, waiting, wrapped in the thin veneer of Thomas Wade's peaceful life. A memory surfaced. Devil's Fork, 7 years ago, the day he'd walked away. He remembered the weight of innocent blood on his hands. The moment he realized that his skill had become a double-edged sword. He'd made a vow then, sealed with the lives of those bystanders, to never draw on another man. But vows, like men, sometimes had to die for something greater. From his window, Wade could see Sheriff Matthews approaching on horseback, probably coming to discuss plans for the town's defense. The lawman would want to organize deputized citizens, set up watches, follow the procedures that usually worked against ordinary threats. But Durant's gang wasn't ordinary, and Wade knew the only way to end this was the old way, the way of the ghost. He checked his drawer once, the motion too fast for eyes to follow. The gun seemed to materialize in his hand, as if conjured from thin air. The speed was still there, the muscle memory preserved like insects in amber. But there was something else too. A weight that hadn't been there in his younger days. The weight of responsibility, of knowing exactly what unleashing the ghost would mean for Redemption Springs. The town had given him 5 years of peace, of quiet mornings and honest work. Now he would repay that gift the only way he could, by becoming everything he'd tried to leave behind. By the time this ended, the name of the ghost would echo through Wyoming again, and the price of that echo would be paid in blood. Wade took one last look at his reflection, at the man he'd built himself into over 5 careful years, and nodded. Goodbye. By sunset that man would be gone, and in his place would stand the legend that had never really died, just slept, waiting for the day violence found him again. Dusk painted Redemption Springs in shades of purple and gold when the Kellerman brothers made their first move. They'd split from the main gang, thinking to catch Wade alone at his ranch. Frank took the front approach, while Tom circled behind. Through the horse corral, their reputation had been built on such tactics, working in tandem, one brother herding prey toward the other's waiting gun. What they didn't know was that Wade had spent 5 years learning every shadow of his land, every creak of wood and whisper of wind. He'd chosen this property specifically for its defensive positions, though at the time he told himself it was for the good, grazing land and reliable well. From his position in the shadows of the barn, Wade watched Frank Kellerman's approach. The man moved well, keeping to cover, checking his angles. But to Wade's experienced eye, each movement revealed volumes. The slight favor of his right leg, the 2-second pattern of his visual sweeps, the way his left hand brushed his holster. On every third step. Just like old times, Wade whispered to himself, though the words tasted bitter. He'd hoped never to read men this way again, calculating kill points and cataloging weaknesses. But the skill, like so many others, had never truly left him. The first shot came from Tom, a warning meant to flush Wade toward his brother. The bullet splintered wood near the barn door, sending chickens scattering in panic. It was a good plan, would have worked on most men. But Wade wasn't most men. His movement was liquid shadow, flowing between patches of darkness. Tom never saw. Him circle behind, never heard the soft bootsteps that had earned Wade his ghostly nickname. One moment, Tom was sighting down his gun barrel at the barn. The next, cold steel pressed against his temple. Drop it. Wade's voice carried none of the rancher's warmth now. This was the voice, the one that had made hardened killers lay down their guns from Dodge City to Tombstone. Tom's gun clattered to the dirt. "Frank!" He managed to cry out before Wade's gunshot rolled across the property. Frank Kellerman spun at his brother's shout, firing toward the sound, but he found himself shooting at empty air. Tom's body crumpled slowly, a hole through his gun hand and another in his shoulder. Wounds meant to incapacitate, not kill. The ghost was sending a message. "Drop the gun, Frank." Wade's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Your brother's alive. Whether you leave here walking or not depends on the next 10 seconds. Frank's gun barrel traced desperate, arcs through the gathering darkness. "Where are you, you devil?" Sweat trickled down his face, despite the evening chill. "Fight like a man." I gave that up. The voice was behind him now, along with any mercy I might have had. Frank whirled, squeezing the trigger. His bullet whined off into empty night. The last thing he saw was a shadow detaching itself from deeper shadows, moving with impossible speed. Pain exploded in his gun arm, his knee, his shoulder, each shot placed with surgical precision to disable without killing. Wade stepped into the last rays of sunlight, his guns still smoking. The Kellerman brothers lay groaning in the dirt, their weapons kicked well out of reach. They'd expected a simple ranch owner, someone to terrorize like they had so many others. Instead, they'd found a ghost made flesh, a legend who moved like death itself. "Tell Durant," Wade said, his voice carrying across the yard, "that this is his only warning. Take your brother and ride out. Don't come back." The sound of approaching horses announced Sheriff Matthews and his deputies, drawn by the gunfire. They found Wade standing calmly in his yard, the Kellerman brothers disarmed and bleeding, but very much alive. The precision of their wounds told a story that made the deputies exchange uneasy glances. No random shots in panic, but the work of a man who could place bullets exactly where he wanted them. "Could have killed them clean," Matthews observed. Quietly, looking at the groaning brothers, Wade's eyes remained fixed on the horizon, where dust clouds suggested Durant and the others were already riding hard toward the sound of gunfire. "Death's too easy," he replied. "I want them to carry the story, want Durant to understand exactly what he's awakened." As his deputies loaded the Kellerman brothers into a wagon for the ride to the town doctor, Matthews studied Wade's stance, the perfect balance, the hands hovering near his guns with unconscious readiness. The quiet rancher was gone completely now, replaced by something both more and less than human. The ghost had returned, and with him came the certainty of violence. That would paint Redemption Springs in shades of lead and blood. Word of the Kellerman brothers' defeat spread through Redemption Springs like wildfire. By midnight, every saloon and boarding house hummed with whispered accounts of how the quiet rancher had transformed into something else entirely, a legend they'd only heard about in trail stories and dime novels. Durant paced the floor of the abandoned Miller homestead where his gang had made camp, his boots wearing paths in the dusty floorboards. The devil on his hand seemed to mock him now as he flexed his fingers. "The ghost of Wyoming," he muttered, throwing back another shot of whiskey. "Of all the cursed luck." The preacher sat in a corner, thumbing through his Bible with trembling hands. Mexican Pete nursed his twisted wrist, his usual swagger replaced by a haunted look. The defeat of the Kellerman brothers had shaken them all. They'd built their reputation on being the meanest dogs in any fight, but now they'd stumbled into the den of a wolf they thought long dead. "We could ride out," Pete suggested, wincing as he adjusted his bandage. "Many other towns, easier marks, and lose everything we've built?" Durant's bottle shattered against the wall. "First sign of weakness. Every two-bit gunslinger from here to Mexico will come hunting us. No, we finish this. We finish him." Back in town, Sheriff Matthews had called an emergency meeting in the church. The pews were packed with townspeople, their faces a mix of fear and determination. Wade stood at the back, a shadow among shadows, listening as Matthews laid out his plans. "We've got 30 able-bodied men," the sheriff announced. "We'll set up watches, fortify key buildings." "Won't work." Wade's quiet voice cut through the murmuring crowd. All eyes turned to him as he stepped forward. "Durant's gang won't play by those rules. They'll burn the town to flush me out, use your families as shields. Best way to protect everyone is to get them out. Sarah Chen stood up from her pew. This is our home. We're not running. Wade's eyes met hers, seeing the same determination. He'd witnessed when she'd helped build the town's first school. Not running, he corrected. Living. Give me 3 days. Get your families to Copper Ridge. Let me deal with this my way. And what way is that? Someone called out. The ghost's way. The words fell like stones in still water. Durant wants to make this personal. I'll give him what he wants. But I won't have innocent blood on my hands. Not again. Matthews studied his friend, seeing the weight of past decisions. In his stance, the town's yours for 3 days, he finally agreed, but I'm staying and anyone else who chooses to. Throughout the night, wagons rolled out of Redemption Springs, carrying women, children, and those who chose safety over pride. A few men remained. Matthews, the Chen family, old Jim Tucker who'd once recognized Wade, and a handful of others who couldn't or wouldn't leave their businesses undefended. Wade spent the hours before dawn working with those who stayed, showing them how to fortify their positions without making them obvious targets. His instructions were precise, delivered with the expertise of a man who'd spent years studying how to survive situations exactly like this. Keep low, stay quiet, he advised, as he helped the Chens reinforce their store's backroom. Durant's gang will expect resistance. What they won't expect is a ghost fighting on your behalf. Sarah watched him work, noting how his movements had changed. The careful efficiency was the same, but now it carried an edge of lethal grace. Will you disappear again? She asked quietly. After it's over? Wade's hand stilled on the boards. He was nailing. The man you knew, the rancher. He's already gone. Had to be. What's left is something I hoped never to be again. He turned to face her, his eyes carrying the weight of countless gunfights. But I promise you this. Durant's gang will never threaten another town after I'm done. As dawn approached, Wade stood on his ranch's porch one last time, watching storm clouds gather on the horizon. Thunder rolled across the plains like distant gunfire, a promise of violence to come. He'd spent 5 years building a life of peace, but peace, he'd learned, was like a garden. It needed protection from those who would destroy it. The ghost of Wyoming had returned, called back by the very thing he'd tried to escape. But this time, he wasn't fighting for vengeance or reputation. This time, he was fighting for something he'd never had before, a home worth protecting, and people worth the weight of becoming a legend once more. Durant sat alone in the abandoned homestead's kitchen, a half-empty bottle of whiskey casting long shadows in the lamplight. The preacher and Mexican Pete had finally fallen into uneasy sleep, but rest eluded their leader. His fingers traced the devil tattoo on his hand, feeling the raised scar tissue beneath the ink, a scar left by a bullet that had passed clean through his palm 7 years ago in Devil's Fork. The memory rose unbidden, the taste of blood and gunpowder, the screams of the innocent, and the cold eyes of the man they now knew as Wade. Durant had been there that day, riding with the Mackenzie gang under a different name. He'd watched from behind a water trough as the ghost cut down 14 men, including James Mackenzie himself. The bullet through his hand had been his parting gift as he fled the carnage. Should have known, he muttered to the empty room. The way he held himself, the way he moved. Death's got a way about it, and he wears it like a second skin. A floorboard creaked behind him. Durant spun, gun-clearing leather, only to find the preacher standing in the doorway, Bible clutched to his chest. Couldn't sleep either? The preacher asked, sliding into a chair. Been reading about Lazarus, man who came back from the dead. He tapped the Bible's worn cover. Seems fitting, considering. The ghost didn't come back from the dead, Durant growled. He's been here all along, playing rancher, pretending at peace. His hand trembled slightly as he poured another drink. But I know what he really is. Saw it that day in Devil's Fork. The preacher leaned forward, curiosity glinting in his eyes. You never told us you were there. Durant's laugh held no humor. Because up until today I was ashamed. Ashamed I ran. Ashamed I was the only one of Mackenzie's men who survived. He rolled up his sleeve, revealing a crude brand, the mark of the Mackenzie gang. 14 men died that day, including the closest thing I had to a father. James Mackenzie took me in when I was nothing, taught me everything I know about killing. And the ghost killed him? Killed him, Durant's voice cracked. He executed him, made him watch as he gunned down every one of his men, saving him for last. But that wasn't the worst part. He took another long pull from the bottle. The worst part was the silence. Never said a word, never showed anger, just moved, like death itself had put on a man's skin and walked among us. Outside, thunder rolled closer as the storm approached. The lamplight flickered, making the devil on Durant's hand seem to dance. Those 3 bystanders who died, Durant continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. They weren't caught in crossfire. Like the stories say, Mackenzie used them as shields, pushed a woman in front of him, held a gun to a child's head. And the ghost, something broke in him when he saw that. The speed, the precision, it all turned into something else, something terrible. The preacher crossed himself. Is that why you picked this town? Why you chose to target the quiet rancher? Durant's eyes reflected lamplight like burning coals. I didn't know, not at first, but now. He flexed his scarred hand. Now I understand. This was always meant to happen. 7 years I've carried this scar, built my reputation, gathered men around me. All of it, everything I've done, was leading to this moment. He stood, walking to the window where lightning illuminated the distant town. The ghost broke that day in Devil's Fork. Broke because he couldn't save those innocents. That's why he quit, why he buried his guns and tried to become something else. A smile curved his lips, but it held no warmth. And now we're going to make him break again. How? The preacher's voice trembled slightly. You saw what he did to the Kellermans? He's just as fast as the stories say, maybe faster. Because this time, we're not just some gang trying to rob a town. Durant turned, and in his eyes blazed a fanatic certainty. We're his past, come back to haunt him. Every person in that town he's grown to care about, every bit of peace he's built. We'll use it all against him. By the time we're done, he'll wish he'd died in Devil's Fork with the others. The storm broke over the homestead, rain lashing against the windows like bullets. Durant stood in the darkness, his scarred hand pressed against the glass, watching. Lightning illuminate the path to Redemption Springs. 7 years of nightmares, of building himself into something that could challenge a legend, had led to this moment. The ghost of Wyoming had given him his devil's mark. Now it was time to return the favor. The storm that had threatened all morning finally broke over Redemption Springs, turning the streets into channels of mud and washing away the last tracks of departing wagons. Wade stood in the sheriff's office, studying a crude map of the town. Spread across Matthew's desk, the few who had stayed, 11 men and Sarah Chen, gathered around him, watching as his weathered finger traced paths through their home. Durant will try to isolate us first, Wade explained, his voice carrying the weight of experience. Cut off the roads, break the telegraph lines, make sure no help can reach us. His finger settled on key points around the town's perimeter. These are the spots he'll watch. And these, he moved to several unmarked buildings, are the blind spots he won't expect us to use. What about the water tower? Matthews asked, pointing to the tall structure that served as the town's landmark. Good vantage point. Too obvious. Wade shook his head. First place they'll check. We need to think like ghosts, not soldiers. Use the spaces between the obvious spots. Sarah watched as Wade transformed their familiar town into a tactical map. The general store where she'd grown up became a fortified position. The alley behind the saloon, where she used to play as a child, was now a potential escape route. Every corner, every shadow held new meaning under Wade's careful instruction. Mr. Chen, Wade turned to Sarah's father, your store's cellar connects to the old mining tunnel, doesn't it? The older man nodded, surprised. How did you notice the marks on your floorboards? Similar setup saved my life in Tombstone. Wade's eyes held a distant look. We'll need to clear it out, make sure it's stable. Could be our lifeline if things go bad. The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Under Wade's direction, they transformed Redemption Springs into something between a fortress and a trap. Supplies were cached in hidden spots throughout town. Sightlines were cleared or blocked, according to Wade's precise instructions. Every building became part of an intricate web of escape routes and defensive positions. Old Jim Tucker, who'd spent his life as a carpenter, worked alongside Wade to create hidden panels and false walls. "Never thought I'd be using my skills for something like this," he muttered, as they concealed a cache of ammunition behind a seamless panel in the church. "Sometimes the best tricks are the simplest ones," Wade replied, showing him how to rig a latch that could be triggered from 3 different positions. "Durant's gang will be looking for obvious fortifications. They won't expect a town that fights back from the shadows." Sarah found Wade alone in the late afternoon as he checked the sightlines from the livery stable's loft. She carried a plate of food that he probably wouldn't eat, just as he hadn't eaten at breakfast or lunch. "You're turning our home into a weapon," she observed, setting down the plate. Wade paused in his work, his hands resting on a support beam he'd been reinforcing. "No," he said quietly. "I'm turning it into a ghost town, but not the kind they expect." He turned to face her, and for a moment she saw past the legend to the man beneath. "In Devil's Fork, I fought in the open, tried to face evil head-on. 3 innocent people died because I was too direct, too proud of my own skill. And now I fight like the ghost they named me for. No fair fights, no heroic stands, just silence and shadow, and the certainty of judgment." His eyes met hers. "Your father should have taken you to Copper Ridge with the others." Sarah's chin lifted. "This is our home. We've built something here worth fighting for." A ghost of a smile touched Wade's lips. "Yes, you have. That's why I need you and your father to be my eyes and ears. You know every creak in your stores, floorboards, every regular customer's habits. That knowledge is worth more than any gun." As dusk approached, Wade gathered everyone in the church one last time. The building had become their central command, its bell tower offering the best protected view of the town's approaches. Rain still fell outside, promising a night of low visibility and treacherous footing. "Tomorrow," Wade told them, his voice carrying to every corner of the sacred space, "Durant will make his first move. Remember what I taught you. No heroes, no stand-up fights. We're all ghosts now. Move quiet, stay smart, and trust the plans we've laid." Sheriff Matthews studied the transformed faces of his townspeople, shopkeepers and farmers who now moved with the careful awareness of hunted animals. Wade had done more than teach them tactics. He'd shown them how to think like survivors. "Never thought I'd see the day," Matthews said softly, "when Redemption Springs became a ghost town while still living." "Sometimes," Wade replied, checking his guns with practiced hands, "the only way to save something is to let it become something else entirely. By sunrise, Durant will learn what it means to hunt a ghost in its own haunting grounds." In the quiet hours before dawn, Wade sat alone in the church's back pew, his guns laid out before him on the wooden seat. Each piece gleamed in the candlelight, cleaned and ready, yet their presence felt like an accusation. 5 years of peace, stripped away in 2 days, and already the familiar weight of the gun belt felt too comfortable on his hips. The soft creak of floorboards announced Matthews's approach. The sheriff carried 2 cups of coffee, offering one to Wade without a word. For a long moment, they sat in silence, steam rising from their cups like morning fog. "The young deputy, Billy Carson," Matthews finally said. "He's been watching you. Way a boy watches his hero in those dime novels." Wade's hands stilled on his gun. "Nothing heroic about what's coming. Maybe not. But he sees what you're doing. For us, for the town. We all do." Matthews sipped his coffee. "Though I suspect the cost to you is higher than any of us know." Wade stood, walking to the church's window. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets slick and black in the pre-dawn darkness. His reflection in the glass showed a man he barely recognized anymore, the peaceful rancher's clothes now worn like a gunfighter's armor. "In Devil's Fork," Wade spoke softly, "there was a girl, Couldn't have been more than 8. Mackenzie grabbed her when his men started falling, held her in front of him like a shield. His knuckles whitened on the windowsill. I made the shot anyway, knew I could. Thread the needle, put the bullet right where it needed to go. Had done it 100 times before. Matthews waited, hearing the weight of 7 years in his friend's voice. The bullet went clean through Mackenzie's eye. Perfect shot, but he fell forward instead of back. His finger tightened on the trigger. Wade's voice dropped to a whisper. I was fast enough to kill him, but not fast enough to save her. The confession hung in the air like gunsmoke. Outside, the first hints of gray touched the eastern sky. That's why you quit, Matthews said. Not because you failed, but because you succeeded. Every gunfight, every kill before that, I told myself. I was serving justice, being judge, jury, and executioner because someone had to be. Wade turned from the window. But watching that girl die, knowing my own pride, my certainty in my skills, had put her in that position. That's when I understood the price of playing God. Young Billy Carson's boots scuffed the doorway as he entered for his morning report. He pulled up short, seeing the 2 men in quiet conversation, but Wade beckoned him forward. Report, Deputy? Billy straightened, trying to match Wade's professional tone. No movement from the Miller place, sir. But we found fresh tracks leading to the North Ridge. Looked like they're setting up watch points, just like you said they would. Wade nodded, studying the young man's eager face. He saw in Billy what he must have looked like once, before the legend, before the blood, when the line between right and wrong seemed clear as dawn. You wanted to know earlier about fast-draw techniques, Wade said, about how to be quicker on the trigger. Yes, sir. Billy's eyes lit up. The secret isn't in the speed. Wade's voice took on the tone of a teacher, though his lesson carried the weight of bitter experience. It's in knowing when not to draw at all, in understanding that once you pull that trigger, you're not just responsible for where the bullet goes, but for everywhere it's been. The young deputy's enthusiasm dimmed slightly, replaced by thoughtful consideration. Matthews watched the exchange with knowing eyes, seeing Wade trying to prevent another ghost from being born. I've killed more men than I can count, Wade continued, and every single one of them deserved it by the law's reckoning. But their deaths left marks on more than just my soul. Widows, orphans, friends who turned to revenge. Every trigger pull sends ripples through the world, and those ripples have a way of coming back as waves. The first real light of dawn crept through the windows, painting the church in shades of gold and shadow. Wade strapped his guns back on, each movement a ritual he'd hoped never to perform again. Remember that, Billy, when Durant's gang comes. We're not fighting for glory or vengeance. We're fighting to protect what these good people have built. And the best victory isn't the fastest draw. It's the one that leaves the least blood on the ground. The midday sun found Wade checking the hidden caches of ammunition they'd placed throughout town when Sarah Chen burst into the church, her face pale with discovery. Someone's been in our store, she said, fighting to catch her breath. The tunnel entrance, it's been marked. Wade was moving before she finished speaking, his boots silent on the wooden floor despite his speed. In the store's cellar, the truth lay plain as day. A small chalk mark on the tunnel's support beam, fresh enough that dust hadn't yet settled on it. Someone had mapped their escape route. Only 11 people knew about this tunnel, Wade said, quietly, his eyes scanning the darkness. 11 people I trusted with the plan. Sheriff Matthews arrived moments later, his face grim. Found these by the livery. He held out several sheets of paper, detailed drawings of their defensive positions, their hidden routes, their fallback points. Everything we planned, written out plain as day. Wade took the papers, his expression unreadable, but Sarah saw his hands tighten on the edges, crumpling the evidence of their betrayal. When? Must have been last night, Matthews replied. During the storm. A creak from above made them all freeze. Wade's gun appeared in his hand without seeming to move, pointing at the cellar stairs. Come out, he called, his voice carrying the chill of the grave. Nice and slow. Billy Carson descended the stairs, his young face twisted with shame and fear. His hands trembled as he held them up. I had to, he whispered. "They have my sister." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Sarah gasped. Matthews cursed, but Wade's aim never wavered. "Tell me everything," Wade commanded, and the story spilled out of Billy like blood from a wound. Durant's men had grabbed Billy's sister from the evacuation wagon, headed to Copper Ridge. A simple note delivered by a Mexican child had laid out the terms, information for her life. Billy had spent the night documenting everything he knew about their preparations. I thought I could warn you after," Billy's voice cracked. "Once she was safe. I didn't know they had someone watching me, following me." Wade finally lowered his gun, but his voice remained hard as steel. "Where were you supposed to meet them?" "North Ridge, sunset." Billy's shoulders slumped. "I've killed us all, haven't I?" "No." Wade's response surprised them all. "You've given us exactly what we need." He turned to Matthews. "Get everyone to the church. Plans have changed." As they gathered in the sanctuary, Wade laid out the betrayed plans on the altar like a sacrifice. "Durant thinks he's won," he told the grim-faced survivors. "Thinks he knows all our moves, but now we know his game." His finger traced the route to the North Ridge. "He's not just coming for me anymore. He's coming for all of you, using you against me, just like Mackenzie used that girl in Devil's Fork." Sarah watched understanding dawn on their faces. Durant had turned their carefully laid defense into a trap, not for them, but for Wade himself. Every hiding spot, every escape route would become a killing ground. "So what do we do?" Matthews asked, his hand resting on his gun. Wade's smile held no warmth. "We give him what he wants, a ghost story." He looked at Billy, who stood apart from the others, shame radiating from his hunched shoulders. "Your sister's life is on me now, son, but I need one thing from you." "Anything," Billy whispered. "I need you to tell Durant exactly what he expects. To hear every detail, every plan." Wade's eyes held a dangerous glint, because while he's watching our shadows, the real ghost will be hunting him. Thunder rolled in the distance as storm clouds gathered once again over Redemption Springs. But this time they brought more than rain. They brought the promise of judgment, as a legend prepared to show Durant why some ghost stories were better left untold. The sun hung low over the North Ridge as Billy Carson approached the meeting point, his boots kicking up dust with each reluctant step. His sister's captor waited in the shadow of a twisted oak. The preacher, Bible in hand, devil in his eyes. "Right. On time, boy," the preacher drawled, but a new voice cut through the evening air. "He's not alone." Wade materialized from the shadows like his namesake, guns trained steady. The preacher's hand froze over his holster. Now," Durant's voice drifted from behind a boulder. "Let's all stay calm. Wouldn't want anything to happen to the girl." He emerged slowly, a knowing smile twisting his features. "Though I suspect you've already figured out she was never here?" Billy's face crumpled. "What?" "Your sister's safe in Copper Ridge, boy. Never touched her." Durant's scarred hand flexed in the dying light. "Just needed you to think we had her. Needed him." He nodded toward Wade. "To come hunting." Wade's guns never wavered. "You went to a lot of trouble to get my attention, Marcus." The use of Durant's first name hit him like a physical blow. "So you do remember?" "Wasn't sure after all these years." "I remember every face from Devil's Fork, even the coward who ran." Durant's laugh held no humor. "Coward! I survived. Watched you destroy everything James Mackenzie built. Watched you gun down the man who was like a father to me." His voice dropped to a venomous whisper. "Watched you sacrifice that little girl for your perfect shot. That's not how it happened." For the first time, emotion cracked Wade's steady tone. "Mackenzie killed her, his finger on the trigger, because you made the choice." Durant's roar echoed off the rocks. The great ghost of Wyoming, so sure of his skills, so certain of his righteousness. "You could have surrendered, could have given Mackenzie what he wanted. But no, your legend was worth more than her life." The truth of that day hung between them like smoke after a gunfight. Wade's fingers tightened on his guns. Not a day goes by I don't see her face. Good. Durant's smile turned cruel. That's what I wanted to hear, because now you're going to feel what I felt. Watching everything you care about burn, knowing it's all your fault. Every person in that town who dies, every building that burns, it's all because the ghost was too proud to stay dead. The preacher began moving slowly to the side, trying to flank Wade, but froze when one of the ghost's guns tracked him without its owner seeming to look. "You've got it wrong, Marcus." Wade's voice carried the weight of 7 years of reflection. "I didn't quit because of pride. I quit because I finally understood what men like Mackenzie, men like you, never will. There's no such thing as a clean shot when you're playing God." Pretty words. Durant's hand drifted toward his holster, but they won't save Redemption Springs. By now, Mexican Pete's already in position. See, while you were following young Billy here, my men were getting ready for a very special show, one that'll make Devil's Fork look like a church social. The dying sun painted the landscape in shades of blood as Wade's worst fears were confirmed. He'd walked into a trap, just as Durant had planned. But the devil-marked killer had forgotten something crucial about ghosts. They were at their most dangerous when you thought you had them cornered. "You're right about one thing, Marcus." Wade's voice carried the finality of a coffin lid closing. "Tonight will make Devil's Fork look like nothing, but not for the reasons you think." The wind picked up, carrying the distant sound of redemption. Springs' church bell, the signal they'd planned, telling Wade that Sarah and the others had reached their positions. Durant might have learned their original plans, but he hadn't counted on Wade's capacity to improvise, to turn a trap into an opportunity. The ghost was about to show the devil why some legends were better left alone. Twilight settled over Redemption Springs like a funeral shroud. Wade moved through the deepening shadows of the town, touching base with each of his defenders one final time. The knowledge of Durant's true plan had changed everything, and nothing. The ghost had always known it would end in fire. Sarah Chen handed out the last of the prepared medical supplies, her father's store now transformed into a field hospital. "We're ready," she told Wade, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Whatever happens, remember what I taught you," Wade replied, checking the hidden panel behind the counter. "If they breach the front, we go through the tunnel to the church," she finished, "but only as a last resort." Her hand touched his arm. "What about you?" Wade's smile didn't reach his eyes. Ghosts don't need escape routes. In the sheriff's office, Matthews was distributing ammunition to his remaining deputies. The betrayed plans lay burned to ash in his fireplace, replaced by new ones that existed only in their heads. Billy Carson stood apart from the others, his young face etched with determination to make things right. "Durant's men will hit hard and fast," Wade explained, drawing lines in the dirt on the floor. "They'll expect us to follow the plans they stole, try to trap us in our own hiding spots." His boot erased the marks. "So we give them shadows to chase while we strike from angles they won't expect." "Like a ghost story," Billy said softly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Everyone's so busy looking for the ghost where they think it should be. They never see it coming from behind," Wade finished. "You've earned back your chance, son. Don't waste it." Old Jim Tucker approached as Wade left the office, his carpenter's hands now holding a shotgun with grim purpose. "Sealed up those false panels you wanted," he reported. "Rigged them just like you said. They'll never know what hit them." "Good man." Wade clasped his shoulder. "Remember, wait for the signal. Timing is everything tonight." The church bell tolled 7 times, marking the hour and sending a shiver through the town. In the gathering darkness, Wade could see Durant's men taking up their positions on the outskirts, just where they thought the stolen plans told them to watch. But Wade had spent 5 years learning every shadow of Redemption Springs, and he'd spent the last hours putting that knowledge to deadly use. He found Matthews making his final rounds, the sheriff's badge catching the last light of day. "Durant thinks he knows me," Wade said quietly. "Thinks he understands what happened at Devil's Fork, but he forgot the most important part of that day. which was, "I didn't just kill Mackenzie's gang, I destroyed something they believed in. The idea that enough guns and enough cruelty could make you untouchable." Wade checked his guns one last time, each motion practiced to perfection. Durant's built his whole life around proving that idea still works. Tonight he learns different. A cold wind swept down the street, carrying the promise of violence. Wade took up his position in the church tower, watching as darkness claimed the town he'd grown to call home. Below, his defenders moved like shadows through the streets, each one carrying a piece of the trap they'd laid for Durant's overconfident killers. "You were right about one thing, Marcus," Wade whispered to the night. "The ghost of Wyoming did die in Devil's Fork, but what came back wasn't what you think." His hands rested on his guns, feeling the familiar weight that had once been his only companion. Tonight isn't about pride or legend or even revenge. It's about showing you why some men walk away from killing not because they're weak, but because they're strong enough to see what it really costs. The first stars appeared in the darkening sky as Wade made his final preparations. Durant thought he was springing a trap on a man too proud to run. Instead, he was about to learn why the ghost's legend had spread so far, not because of how many men he'd killed, but because of how completely he could dismantle those who thought violence was the answer to everything. Redemption Springs held, its breath, waiting for the storm to break. In the distance, a wolf howled, a lonely sound that seemed to call for judgment. Wade's answer was silence, the deadly quiet of a ghost preparing to show the devil himself why some legends were best. Left to rest, Mexican Pete struck first, setting fire to the livery stable exactly where the stolen plans had marked their ammunition cache. Flames leaped into the night sky, casting wild shadows across the empty street. But when Pete crept inside to prevent anyone from fighting the blaze, he found nothing but hay bales where gunpowder should have been. The crack of a rifle shot split the night. Pete dove for cover, cursing as he recognized the trap. They'd wanted him here, wanted the fire for light. Every shadow now held the possibility of death, and no one had ever survived long once the ghost decided they needed killing. "Looking for these?" Wade's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The sound of ammunition boxes being opened echoed through the stable. "Amazing what you can hide under fresh-laid floorboards." Pete's knife cleared its sheath. "Show yourself, ghost." "Why?" The voice moved, impossible to track. "You're doing fine on your own." Another shot cracked out, this one splintering the wood near Pete's head. He spun, firing blindly into the shadows, but hit nothing. The flames were spreading now, turning the stable into an inferno of shifting light and darkness. Perfect hunting ground for a ghost. Across town, the preacher led 4 men toward the general store, confident in their stolen intelligence about the tunnel entrance. They found the store dark and seemingly abandoned, exactly as expected. But when they tried to open the concealed door to the cellar, they triggered Jim Tucker's specially prepared surprise. The floor gave way beneath them, dropping them into a pit lined with waiting deputies. Before the preacher could even raise his gun, Matthew's voice rang out, "Drop them or die where you stand." For once, the man of God chose silence over scripture. Durant watched the first phase of his attack unravel from his position near the beast church. The fires were spreading, but not according to plan. His men were disappearing into the shadows one by one, taken by an enemy that seemed to move like smoke through their carefully laid ambush. "Come on out, ghost!" Durant roared, his voice carrying over the crackling flames. "Face me like a man, like Mackenzie faced that little girl." Durant spun, guns clearing leather, but found only empty air where Wade's voice had been. Another figure moved in the firelight, Billy Carson standing in the middle of the street with a rifle aimed steady. "He's right, Mr. Durant," Billy called. "Out about everything, about what men like you really are." "Brave words from a traitor," Durant sneered, turning his guns toward the young deputy. The move saved Wade's life. Mexican Pete had managed to escape the burning stable, circling behind where he thought Wade would be. His knife sliced through the air where Wade's throat had been a moment before, but the ghost was already moving. Their fight was a dance of shadows in the firelight. Pete's blade whistled through empty air as Wade seemed to flow around each strike like water. Then came the sound that had haunted Pete's nightmares since hearing the stories, the whisper-soft slide of a gun clearing leather faster than human eyes could follow. 2 shots, no louder than a hand clap. Pete's knives fell from nerveless fingers as he stared at his hands, each with a neat hole through the palm. "How?" he gasped. "Practice," Wade answered simply, before his gun butt found the base of Pete's skull, ending the knife fighter's part in the night's drama. The fight for Redemption Springs spread through the streets like the fire itself. Durant's remaining men found themselves caught in a maze where every shadow held death and every hiding spot became a trap. The ghosts seemed to be everywhere at once, each appearance marked by the precise crack of gunfire and another outlaw falling. But Durant himself remained elusive, working his way closer to the church where he knew the final confrontation would have to take place. The devil on his hand seemed to burn as he moved through the chaos he'd created, seeking the one man he'd spent 7 years preparing to kill. In the church tower, Sarah Chen watched it all unfold through her father's spyglass. She saw Wade's plan working with deadly precision, the way he used the fire's light to create deeper shadows, the careful herding of Durant's men into prepared killing grounds, the legend of the ghost reborn in blood and gunsmoke. But she also saw what Wade couldn't: Durant's steady progress toward his true target. The devil-marked killer hadn't come to destroy a town. He'd come to break a legend. And as she watched him slip through the church's side door, Sarah realized the night's deadliest dance was about to begin. The church stood silent amid the chaos of Redemption Springs, its stained glass windows reflecting the dance of flames from the burning buildings outside. Durant moved through the shadows of the sanctuary, his boots silent on the worn floorboards. The devil tattoo on his hand seemed to writhe in the shifting light as he kept his gun trained on the darkness ahead. "You know what I realized, Ghost?" Durant's voice echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "All these years I thought Devil's Fork broke you, made you soft, made you hide away in this tiny town, pretending to be something you're not." He paused by the altar, scanning the shadows. "But that wasn't it at all, was it?" "No." Wade's voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a whisper that filled the sacred space. "It didn't break me, it woke me up." A floorboard creaked to Durant's left. He fired, the muzzle flash momentarily illuminating empty air. The bullet hole in the wall added another scar to the old building's face. 7 years, Durant continued, trying to track the invisible presence he could feel moving through the darkness. 7 years I spent building myself into someone who could face you, learning every story, every technique, every kill that made you legend. His scarred hand flexed on his gun grip. "And you know what I learned? That legends are built on fear." Wade's voice moved again, impossible to pin down. "That men like you and Mackenzie need them, need something bigger than yourselves to blame for your own failings." Durant's laugh held no humor. "No, I learned that the ghost of Wyoming was just a man who could bleed, who could fail, who could watch a little girl die because he was too proud to back down." The silence that followed was deafening. Durant strained his ears, trying to locate his quarry in the darkness. Outside, gunfire still crackled through the streets as the last of his gang faced the justice they'd earned. "You're right." Wade's voice came soft and clear, directly behind him. Durant spun, firing even as he turned, but Wade was already moving. The ghost materialized from the shadows like smoke given form, his guns appearing in his hands as if conjured. Durant dove behind a pew as bullets splintered the wood where he'd stood. The battle that followed was a dance of death through the sacred space. Both men moved with the fluid grace of killers who had turned violence into art, their guns speaking in whispers. And thunderclaps. Bullets scarred the walls and shattered the peace of decades, each shot a prayer of violence in the house of God. Durant was good, better than Wade had expected. 7 years of preparation showed in every move, every shot, every calculated attempt to draw the ghost into a fatal mistake. But Wade had spent those same years learning something Durant couldn't understand: how to carry the weight of death without being consumed by it. "You still don't see it, do you?" Wade called out as they circled each other through the church. "What really happened that day in Devil's Fork?" "I saw everything," Durant's voice cracked with rage. "Saw you murder the only family I had. Saw you sacrifice an innocent girl for your perfect shot." "No." Wade's voice carried the weight of 7 years of reflection. "You saw what you wanted to see. What men like you always see. Nothing but the violence." A shadow moved in Wade's peripheral vision. Sarah Chen crouched in the choir loft with her father's rifle. He gave an imperceptible shake of his head, warning her to stay back. This was between him and Durant now, between the ghost and the devil who couldn't let go of the past. "You want to know what really broke in Devil's Fork?" Wade continued, moving like liquid shadow through the church. "It wasn't me. It was my belief that men like us could ever bring justice through the barrel of a gun." Durant laughed bitterly. "Pretty words from a man with 2 guns in his hands. These aren't for justice." Wade's voice hardened. "They're for stopping men who never learned what I did. That every bullet leaves a wake of pain behind it. Touching. Lives we never even see." The dance continued, each man seeking an advantage, their shots echoing through the sacred space like thunder. But slowly, inexorably, Wade began to push Durant back. The devil-marked killer found himself running out of shadows to hide in, his careful plans unraveling in the face of a legend he thought he understood. 7 years, Wade said softly, his voice carrying in a momentary lull. 7 years I've carried the weight of that girl's death, walked away from killing, tried to build something that didn't end in blood. And then you came, bringing violence to my home, threatening innocent people, all because you couldn't let go of a ghost story. Shut up and fight. Durant's shots went wild, his carefully cultivated control cracking. "I'm not fighting you, Marcus." Wade moved through the darkness with deadly purpose. "I'm showing you why the ghost had to die, why some legends need to stay buried." The end came with the terrible inevitability of judgment. Durant, backing away from a shadow, stumbled against the altar steps. In the split second, his balance wavered. Wade appeared before him like death incarnate. Their guns spoke as one. Durant's shot passing through the space Wade had already left, Wade's bullet striking with the precision that had made him legend. The devil tattoo on Durant's hand blossomed red as the gun fell from nerveless fingers. He stared at the wound, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Same shot," he whispered, "same as Mackenzie." "No." Wade stood over him, guns still trained steady. "Mackenzie died because he wouldn't let go of that girl. You're dying because you wouldn't let go of the past." Durant's laugh turned to a cough. "Doesn't matter, town's still burning, your peace is still broken. Ghost or rancher, you'll never escape what you are." "Maybe not." Wade's voice carried no triumph, only a tired acceptance. "But I can choose what I do with it, choose to protect instead of destroy. That's what you never understood about Devil's Fork, about why I walked away." The devil-marked killer's eyes began to glaze, his life bleeding out onto the church floor. "Tell me," he gasped, "tell me what I never saw." Wade knelt beside his fallen enemy, his voice soft but carrying the weight of truth. "I saw myself in Mackenzie that day, saw what I'd become, a man so sure of his own righteousness that he'd risk anything, sacrifice anyone to prove he was right. That's why I quit. Not because I was broken, but because I finally understood the cost of playing God." Durant's last breath carried a sound that might have been understanding or might have been denial. The devil on his hand seemed to fade as his life drained away, leaving just another scar on another dead man's skin. Wade stood slowly, his guns returning to their holsters with the same liquid grace that had drawn them. Outside, the sounds of gunfire had faded, replaced by the crackling of contained fires and the shouts of townspeople fighting to save their homes. The ghost had done its work, and now it was time for Thomas Wade to help his neighbors rebuild. Dawn broke over Redemption Springs. Pale light, revealing the cost of the night's violence. Scorched buildings stood like black teeth against the morning sky, while townspeople worked to clear debris from the streets. The bodies of Durant's gang had been laid out behind the sheriff's office, awaiting proper burial despite their sins. Wade stood on his ranch's porch, watching the sun climb over the eastern hills. His guns lay cleaned and oiled on the table beside him, alongside a fresh cup of coffee that steamed in the morning chill. Sarah Chen approached quietly, carrying bandages for the graze wound he'd taken during the fight. "The fire crews have the last flames under control," she reported, setting to work on his arm. "Everyone's saying it's a miracle we didn't lose more buildings." "Not miracle," Wade replied softly. "Planning, and good people willing to fight for their home." Sheriff Matthews rode up as Sarah finished her ministrations. His face carried the weariness of a long night, but his eyes held respect as he looked at Wade. "Town council's meeting this afternoon, talking about rebuilding." Wade nodded, understanding the unspoken question. The ghost did what was needed. Time for him to rest again. "And Thomas Wade?" Sarah asked, her hand lingering on his arm. A small smile touched Wade's lips as he looked out over the land he'd worked for 5 years. "Still has fences to mend, cattle to tend." His eyes met hers. "Books to borrow." Matthews smiled, tipping his hat as he turned his horse. "Good to know some things don't change." The town would recover, Wade knew. Buildings would be repaired. Scars would fade, and life would find its rhythm again. Some would tell stories about the night the ghost of Wyoming returned, but those tales would slowly fade into legend, just as he had before. Wade lifted his guns from the table, feeling their familiar weight one last time. Then he walked into his house, climbed the attic stairs, and carefully wrapped them in their oiled canvas. The trunk closed with a final thud, locking away more than just steel and wood. Outside, the morning breeze carried the promise of rain. Wade picked up his work gloves and headed toward the north pasture, where broken fence posts needed replacing. The ghost had done its work. Now it was time for a rancher to do his. Peace, he had learned, wasn't the absence of violence, but the choice to build something stronger than fear. And as the sun rose over Redemption Springs, Thomas Wade walked into another quiet day, carrying the weight of his legend, with the ease of a man who had finally learned to live with both his past and his peace.